Some kids from my class for 1 year were lucky enough to go to Europe for a school field trip. We would be spending a few days and nights in France, and one of my good friends was on the trip with me, which made it even better. We weren't assigned to the same room for sleep though, which was the only downside of the trip. At the end of the first day, we were all assigned rooms and went our separate ways. My room was on the 3rd floor, and my friend's room was on the 2nd floor. On her floor, every room had a balcony with a sliding glass door, but mine didn't. I just had a small window that looked down at the row of balconies below. If I leaned a little, I could see her balcony clearly. At first, it was kind of funny. I had brought way too much candy, so I'd opened my window and tossed some down to her. A few nights later, I was having trouble falling asleep, and I went to go look out the window for a bit. Because we were staying in a busy city, I figured there would be something I could watch out the window. As I was looking out the window, I heard a sound coming from below me. So I opened my window to investigate because it sounded like it was right below me on one of the balconies. When I leaned out and looked down, there was someone standing on my friend's room balcony. They were wearing all black and they were facing the glass door, leaning slightly forward like they were trying to see inside. I remember yelling down at them saying something like, "Hey," or "What are you doing?" Upon looking up at me after I said something, the figure then stepped up onto the railing and jumped off the balcony down onto the ground level. I watched as they ran away and disappeared into the night. I stayed at the window for a decent while, waiting to see if they would come back. In the morning, I went down to my friend's room and told her everything. She listened, but she didn't react the way I expected. She just nodded and said that she thought she had seen someone too, but assumed it was her sleep paralysis. We went onto her balcony to check it out, and upon re-entering her room, we realized that the lock on the sliding door wasn't working. Unsure if it had been busted somehow or if it just didn't catch, we ended up putting a chair in front of the handle and leaving it there for the last night that we would be staying there. Whenever I woke up in my sleep that next night, I went to look out the window at my friend's balcony just in case. Outside of that incident, it was a great school trip, and I'm so glad that I caught the intruder in the act of breaking into my friend's room. This happened about 3 years ago on a school trip. We stayed at this outdoor activity center with cabins, a climbing wall, and a stretch of forest right next to it. It was one of those trips where the whole schedule was planned out, but it still felt like freedom because we were so far away from home. We got there, dropped our bags off in our rooms, and went straight into activities. Throughout that first and second day, people kept noticing a man was watching our class from the woods. The first time anyone noticed him was during rock climbing. There was a wooden area right beside the climbing wall. It wasn't dense, but it was thick enough that you couldn't see far in. One of my friends pointed out that someone was standing near the edge of the trees. The man wasn't moving, just standing there, partly in the shade of the trees. We told the instructor about him. Since the place was private, he didn't take it lightly. He and another staff member walked over to check. We all watched them go into the trees. It took a few minutes, but they came back saying that no one was there. They even joked that maybe we were just trying to get out of climbing. After that, things went back to normal for a bit, but people kept glancing at the forest. Later that day, we had a scavenger hunt sort of thing in the woods. We were split into groups and given maps to find markers in the woods. It was supposed to be simple, but some people didn't take it seriously. A couple of my classmates disappeared from their group. When they came back, they looked shaken, but tried to laugh it off. Eventually, they admitted what happened. They had gone deeper into the forest to be alone and make out. They said that they realized a man was standing out there watching them, and eventually he began walking slowly towards them once he had been spotted. That was when they booked it out of there to join up with their group again. They ran back after that. That story spread fast, but most people treated it like something weird rather than something serious. By nighttime, it had turned into kind of a joke. That changed for me later. It was around midnight, maybe a bit later. A few of us were still awake in the cabin. I got up to use the bathroom. I remember standing there peeing when the light suddenly went out. The light switch was outside the bathroom door, so I knew my friends were playing a prank on me. I went back into the cabin and started yelling at my friends, asking if they had done it. They were confused and a bit annoyed at first, but they could tell I was serious. We eventually tried to turn on a different light, and that was when everyone in the cabin came to the same realization that the power was out. Not long after, we heard a soft knock on our door. We honestly thought that it was a counselor letting us know about the power outage, but as we were about to unlock the door, one of us noticed through the window that one of the other cabin's lights were still on. Our teacher's and chaperone's cabin was next to us about 50 feet away, and all their lights were still on, as they were up late playing cards or something. As the knocking got more persistent, we called out through the door for the person to identify themselves. Because we never heard an answer, we left the door locked and shut. I guess we must have been getting really loud and screaming at whoever was outside the door, because one of our teachers came out of the cabin next door, and we could see them walking over to our cabin. Our teacher arrived, and we explained that our power was out and someone had been knocking persistently on our door. Upon further inspection with staff from the camp, it was discovered that the power specifically to only our cabin had been cut at the power box area. Everyone that was there, the teachers, staff, and students, got together the following morning. After a discussion and multiple students mentioning their stories of seeing a man watching them from the edge of the woods during various activities, it was decided that it would be best if the trip was cut short. We left the activity center later that afternoon, and nobody was even mad about it after hearing what had happened with the power going out in our cabin and the knocking on the door. This happened on a school trip to two of my girlfriends and I when we were 15 and 16 years old. Some students and teachers went to Italy, and the trip itself was alright, but being the dumb teenagers we were, we decided to push the boundaries. Our school had booked us into an average hotel, low budget. So one night, two of my friends asked me if I wanted to sneak out with them during the night and go to a beach nearby. I'm generally quite sensible, but they kept persuading me until I finally gave in. We waited until about 1 a.m., messaged each other when to leave our rooms, and met in the hallway. It was only the three of us, and we didn't want anyone else to know as they might snitch on us. The teachers were sleeping in rooms opposite ours, so we had to be quiet as to not get caught. I can remember still how worried I was that we would get caught and they would call my parents. But we were successful and snuck our way down to the lobby. For whatever reason, no one was at the front desk, so we hurried through the lobby and out the front door, not waiting around to get caught. None of us knew Italian, so this was possibly one of the dumbest things we could have done. We walked for about 2 miles down to the beach, all smug that we had actually managed to pull off our plan. The streets were completely empty, not surprising considering it was 1 o'clock in the morning, but it didn't stop that anxious feeling in the back of my mind. I knew what we were doing could get us in so much trouble if we were caught. We had to walk down hundreds of steps in order to actually get to the beach. The beach was really quite beautiful. It was a full moon that night, so the beach was lit up in a beautiful soft light. We had the whole place to ourselves. We messed around for 10 minutes or so, and then my friends said that they wanted to go into the sea. I was adamant that I wasn't going in, despite their protests, so they told me to keep an eye on their stuff. We had only brought a few jackets and our phones. They rolled up their pants and went knee-deep into the sea. I started filming them and taking pictures. The others would be so jealous, I remember thinking, just wait till they saw the photos. They spent about 5 minutes splashing around in the cold sea before coming back onto the beach and started stripping off more. I couldn't believe it. They wanted to go swimming, and the water was fairly cold too. They had the genius idea to go in their underwear. I couldn't stop laughing at this point, but looking back at it, I should have persuaded them not to. I didn't understand that swimming at night could be dangerous, especially in an area you've never swam in before. They were screaming and giggling in the freezing water, and I stood on the shore laughing and filming them. While filming and guarding their things, I got this eerie feeling of being watched. I could only chalk it up to instinct. Naturally, I put my guard up and looked around. I'm so glad I did, because I saw 2 men were sitting maybe 30 meters from us in the dark. I can't be sure as I only noticed them for a second before turning back around, but it looked like one of the men was holding his phone up, filming us. I saw them once and it was a quick glance, because I didn't want them to realize that I had seen them. I had a bad feeling and I called out to both of my friends in the water. They must have noticed the tone of my voice was completely shaken despite my best efforts to be discreet. They walked up the sand towards me, dripping wet and freezing cold. I told them 2 men were sitting behind us, watching us. I'd never seen them so scared after they realized. That's when the gravity of our situation hit us. No one knew we were there at the beach. As far as everyone else was concerned, we were fast asleep in our hotel rooms. These men could halt us and probably take us without anybody knowing for multiple hours. I whispered to my friends that we needed to leave right away. I told them not to bother getting dressed, just grab their stuff and leave as inconspicuously as possible. They agreed with no hesitation. At this point, I was really worried that the men must have known that we saw them despite our best efforts to appear nonchalant. As we approached the steps, I took a quick glance behind us. The men were now slowly walking towards us. Fight or flight kicked in, and I shouted at my friends to run. Barefoot and soaked, they scrambled up the steps as quickly as they could. We kept pushing, but I didn't want to look behind me in fear of tripping over a step. We didn't stop once we reached the top of the steps and onto the pavement. We were running on pure adrenaline at this point. I looked down to see both my friends' feet were bloody, but they didn't stop. We didn't stop running until the hotel was in sight. I turned around again, and to my relief, I couldn't see the men. We walked through the entrance to the hotel. This time, however, there was a man at the front desk. He started talking in Italian. We didn't understand him, so we kept walking, my friends leaving bloody footprints through the lobby. Once we reached the hallway, we made a mutual vow to never tell anyone about that night, and we all went back to our rooms. The man at the front desk must have told our teachers that he saw us walking through the hotel leaving bloody footprints everywhere, because that morning I awoke to a loud banging on our door. Our teachers were angry, demanding to know who had snuck out the previous night. My two friends spoke up and admitted it was them, and thankfully they left my name out of it, which I'll forever be grateful for. The teachers were furious, as you could imagine. My friends received phone calls home, and they had to delete all the pictures taken on their phones that night. I always think back to how that night could have ended, how horribly wrong it could have gone, and despite it being one of the dumbest things I've ever done, I'm glad I decided to go. It terrifies me to think what could have happened if I hadn't been there, and if it was my two friends alone together out on the sea with those men on the beach. This happened when I was in 7th grade on a school field trip. It was just our grade for the trip, and it was a smaller school, so we only needed one bus to bring everyone to the field trip. We took a trip to this old retreat center out in the middle of nowhere. It used to be some kind of religious complex, but by the time we went, it was mostly used for tours and occasional events. The place was enormous, with long hallways, multiple floors, and wings that didn't even seem connected logically. It didn't feel abandoned exactly, but it definitely felt old and underused. We had a guide walking us through different rooms, including chapels, meeting halls, and dorm-style bedrooms. But after lunch, things kind of fell apart. The staff didn't really have anything planned for the rest of the afternoon, so the teachers let us wander into small groups, just telling us to stay inside the main areas that we had already toured. I was with two friends, and we weren't necessarily trying to get into trouble, but we ended up in this quieter section of the building where the lights were dimmer and there weren't any other groups around. We came upon a service door or something that led to a narrow corridor. It was completely dark in the corridor, and the door and surrounding area were unmarked without any signs, but we were feeling adventurous. We thought maybe it would lead to some secret basement or something that we could check out. There were surprisingly a lot of side rooms in the small corridor, with most of them being small closets or supplies or janitorial stuff. Most of all these rooms were locked, but we happened upon a door that was locked strangely. There was a small window up at the top of the door, so we took turns standing on each other's shoulders so that we could see into the room. We were hoping to find a secret chapel or maybe like a hermit abode from ancient religious days, but we saw a questionable room instead. What we saw with the light shining our phones through the tiny window was what appeared to be some sort of ancient torture room. Maybe it was some sort of prison cell or even a kennel for housing dogs too. It was hard to tell, but there were for sure some old rusty-looking chains anchored to the wall, an array of either tools or weapons on the ground. The room was definitely out of place with the rest of what we had seen in that dark corridor and the rest of the large complex. We thought that it was strange, but we didn't question it too much as the building was very old, and the room was probably used at a different time, and it was now just hidden inside the massive complex. It made sense to us that the room had been locked to keep people out, and it had been abandoned over the years. Not long after seeing the strange old room, we exited the mystery corridor that we had found and reunited with the rest of our class, which was leaving soon to go back to school. A couple years later, when we were in high school, we heard on the news that the 7th grade field trip for that year to that same religious complex had been canceled. It was canceled because during some recent renovations or something like that to the portions of the building, plastic sealed up bags filled with blood had been found. I guess DNA testing or something else had connected the items to a previous murder. As soon as we heard the news, my friends and I instantly thought back to our visit there, and if the murder correlated in some way to that creepy old out-of-place room we had seen many years ago. This was a great number of years ago in the early 1990s. We went away for the weekend on a school field trip to a camp retreat setting out in the woods. This was my first time actually being selected to go. I was the class clown back in the day, often performing pranks on other classmates and teachers. But that specific year I was on my best behavior, and this was my reward. My pranking days were behind me. Our teacher, who was one of the chaperones for the trip, was a man who I will call Mr. Adams. He was very well known around the community for always organizing charity events to raise funds for the school and various other charities. Back in the 90s, it wasn't uncommon for parent-teacher chaperones to sleep in the same room as a group of kids. There was generally one adult per room of kids to keep them in line and to keep the kids out of trouble. For that trip, Mr. Adams was the chaperone for my room. The school trip I spent with him was a ton of fun, and he really kept us all motivated for the activities that we took part in at the camp. On the first night, however, I noticed that he'd gotten up from his bed on numerous occasions. I assumed it was due to other kids misbehaving in the other rooms. Nothing happened to me at all that night, but the next day my friend, who was also in our room, had dared me to perform a prank on the teacher. I told him my pranking days were over, but after some constant gestures from my friend, I decided to perform one last prank. Mr. Adams had left the room that night once again. He was gone for a while. We had taken some cello tape earlier that day when he'd left the room that night. We had literally made a web out of the tape for him to walk into when he entered the door. We'd waited a long time for him to enter, and I found it a struggle not to fall asleep. I had just started to doze off, when suddenly he entered the room, reacting to walking into the tape. He knew instantly it was me. My friends and I were hysterical, and we were lucky that he saw the funny side too. However, he'd said to me, "You're lucky this isn't the 70s, because I would have canned you, and I would have enjoyed it too," and then he laughed. Nothing happened to me at all from that trip, but it wasn't until 4 years later that it came out that Mr. Adams was a predator. He'd been arrested, and his arrest made the headlines in our hometown. He had 44 cases towards children, mostly girls, against his name. 2 of the incidents actually happened during that one trip that I'd been on, and I felt terrible when I heard it. We were boys, so I wondered if that meant we were relatively safe from his abuse, but with the prank we played on him that one night, we could have triggered him or something. He had also been charged for attempted murder as he tried to kill a victim who had threatened to report him. He'd done so much for the community, but all that he had done was just a way to gain trust so that he could get away with all his crimes for years. He was arrested for many years and eventually ended up dying in prison. I'm glad that nothing happened to me, but also shocked at how close I was to something terrible happening.